Bolton-on-Thames, Surrey, which is where I was born, is about 20 miles southwest of London. And when I was very young, it was just a country stop on the railway line, and it is now part of Greater London and very much suburbia. And I know the ins and outs of it, but there are very few places that you recognize in terms of the way it used to be. But it's a very sweet place. It's sort of the middle village between a very upmarket village and a very low poverty village, at least in the early days. My mother remarried when I was about 4 or 5 years old. So I then went to live with my mother and my stepfather. And he was a fine tenor. He had a singing voice. He was from Canada, from Toronto. He joined forces in more ways than one with my mother, in that she was a really wonderful pianist and probably should have been a performing concert pianist, but in fact, due to circumstances and the war and tremendous poverty and things like that, they became part of a vaudeville act, and consequently I knew nothing else but that. And to their amazement, I think, they discovered when I was about 8 years old, my stepfather, I think in an attempt to become a little closer to me, decided to give me some singing lessons, because my school had closed down because of the escalation of the war, and I think he thought it might just sort of keep me quiet, so to speak. And they discovered that I had this 4-octave soprano voice, which surprised them, since it was my stepfather who sang, not my real dad at all. And so I knew nothing but vaudeville, music hall. Gradually began to appear with my mum and my stepdad and tour the halls, and made a fairly important for me debut when I was about 12 years old. My stepfather was very smart in that he knew he didn't have the ability to teach, and because it was such a very young voice, but such a sort of oddly powerful one, he knew that he had to put me in good hands if he could. And so he took me to his teacher, who was a very fine dramatic soprano, an English dramatic soprano, and she'd done a lot of Handel and I can't even think of the right word at this point, but she was a very gentle woman, and I was with her for most of my early life. Only when I went to Broadway did I kind of not work with her, and of course I prepared with her to go to Broadway, but she didn't actually come with me. But the foundation that she gave me, the technical foundation, was terrific. I sang in those days a lot of sort of opera and operetta. I felt that I knew, and I believe that I was right, that I really didn't have the voice for it. My own voice was very white, very, very thin, and I was able to do these incredible sort of gymnastics with it, tremendous sort of calisthenics, but in a coloratura way. And it was so high that sort of dogs for miles around would howl when I took some of the high notes on. But she gave me the groundwork of opera. And she always said, go beyond your reach. If you're doing something light, practice something even more difficult. Practice it a tone up, so that when the night comes and you have to sing it, it is so within your range. And for many, many years I did that. It was a sophisticated London revue, and it was at a theatre which is no longer there. It was called the London Hippodrome, and it's now just a sort of a nightclub in Leicester Square, London. But it was a very beautiful theatre, and I was literally the smallest person on the bill. And because it was so sophisticated, the producers thought perhaps it wasn't right that I would be singing in this show. And the night before we opened, they decided that they couldn't use me. And of course, my mum, being somewhat of a stage mum, sort of said, no, you can't do this to this child. It's her great debut and so on. So she and my stepfather and their agent descended on the poor producer. And they said, she'll sing a much more difficult song, and you'll see. And so I auditioned for a much more difficult song, and the end result was that I was in the show, stayed in the show, and on opening night the audience went crazy, and it was a complete standing ovation. First thing I'd ever really done, first time I'd ever really tried anything that important. And the press followed me home, you know, the kind of thing when you're a young fluke in a way. And that was the beginning of a very busy few years, right through my teens, of touring and radio and early television and so on. My dad was a very special human being. He had an innate decency. It didn't come from... He was very bright. He was a nature-loving man. He treated all of us in the family, including his wife's other children, his first wife's other children. He treated us all the same and as beloved equals. And we knew he was special. I mean, obviously, any dad to a young girl is special if he does all the right things, and my dad certainly did. But he's the one that instilled in me any true reality in my life, because on the one side I had this mad upbringing of vaudeville and touring a great deal and very little schooling, and my father was the one that took me on nature walks, took me to the swimming baths, taught me how to swim, took me down to the seaside in freezing cold weather, and we dipped in the sea, and somehow when we climbed the local hills, and he gave me a love of books. There was a book that he gave me, which it's interesting that you ask that, a book that he gave me, obviously, you know, Wind in the Willows and all the classic children's books, but there was a little book that we found, and he leafed through it, and he said, "Here you are, darling, I think you'll like this." And it was a very small children's novel called The Little Grey Men by an English author called B.B. And it was a very simple nature tale of the last 4 gnomes left on this earth in England. It very much like Watership Down, that kind of big nature study. And it was set in 4 seasons. It was a terrific adventure story. I swallowed it up, and it went out of print. And I subsequently have started my own imprint at HarperCollins, and it's coming out this fall. I'm bringing it back again, and I'm absolutely delighted about it. It's one of our mission statements is to bring back books that are worthy of a revisitation in a way, and this is the first one. So it's kind of, and I write about it as a little chapter before it begins. I also loved to scribble as a kid. I loved to write and eventually, because I didn't have a formal education, a governess was found for me who traveled with me wherever I went, because touring in vaudeville, you're a week in one place, a week in another, and you could not settle into any school. So I had this wonderful lady who traveled with me who quickly recognized that if she wanted me to do anything, all she had to do was say, "Do this first, and then you may write your story." And whatever story I was going to write, because that was obviously what I loved to do most of all. And she was a very gentle, very kind lady, and I loved her. I have retained some very close friends from my home village, but actually I didn't have many peers, not young friends in those days. It was all mostly adults, because of the touring, because of the vaudeville. But the kind of education I was getting was that strange one of standing in the wings and watching phenomenal performers performing every week, every night. And watching everything from comedians to jugglers to animal acts and different kinds of comedians and dancers, and it was extraordinary. And I didn't think I was getting an education at the time. It's only in retrospect that I realized that stood me in very good stead in my